Welcome to another video from ExplainingComputers.com. For some people, a key barrier to using Linux is that it cannot run Photoshop, Illustrator, Premiere Pro and other applications in the Adobe Creative Cloud suite. In this video, we're therefore going to look at Linux alternatives to Adobe software for photo editing, illustration and video production. This will include some established applications as well as some exciting new arrivals that offer great promise for doing creative work in Linux. Right, let's start with Photoshop alternatives, or in other words applications that allow us to manipulate pixels. Here, probably the most widely used Linux application is the GNU Image Manipulation Program, or GIMP. Here, the interface is a bit different to Photoshop, and for reference, this is what the Photoshop interface looks like, and if we come back to GIMP, things can be a bit off-putting for those making the transition. Nevertheless, GIMP offers a very decent range of painting tools. We can do exciting things like that. We can even draw fruit straight out of the interface, which is very exciting. And more seriously, if we go across to a photograph and we go to colors, we've got all the usual controls available for editing photographs. We can manipulate, for example, levels here. Don't really need to in this image, but we could if we wanted to. We can do a split view and compare what's going on, all that type of very important stuff. GIMP can also load and export Photoshop format PSD files, although there are significant fidelity problems. For example, if we try to load in one of my YouTube thumbnail composites, got one I think over there like that, we get a message which says there are compatibility issues, specifically text layers will be rasterized and their effects are not supported. So if we bring the document in, it looks like this here in GIMP, whereas if we take a look at it back in Photoshop, the original has got white strokes around the drives and black text. But back in GIMP, the strokes and the black text have disappeared because layer effects are not supported, and because it's been rasterized, the text is also not editable. Also on the downside, GIMP does not have a CMYK color mode for professional print work, although it can import and export CMYK JPEGs, TIFFs and PSDs. For many people, GIMP remains their go-to Linux photo editor and raster art package, and indeed I have a separate video that covers it in more depth. But personally, I think there are better Photoshop alternatives for Linux. Before we get to my own preferred application, let me show you a very interesting curveball, which is Panther. This describes itself as a professional image editor for the Linux desktop and is a proprietary Linux-only application that shows great promise. Right now, it's still in alpha, currently version 0.74 as I'm making this video, and it's got a one-off price of $69.99, which includes all future updates. And there's also a 30-day free trial that does not require an account to be created or payment details to be entered. So let's take a look at the application. It's running down here. Hello. And straight away we see that Panther has a pretty Photoshop-like interface. Currently the program has fewer features than GIMP or Photoshop, but if we look across the menus at the top, things here are pretty familiar. We can see the sort of things we see in Photoshop. It's very standard stuff, and in my view Panther is already a usable piece of software with a very nice feel. And unlike in GIMP, if we go to File and New, we can see we can create documents with a CMYK color space for print work. This said, some things do need attention. For example, whilst we're on this layer here, which is that one, if we go to Layer and Layer Effects and we want to add a stroke, let's just go over there and add a stroke like that. It looks roughly okay, but the bigger it gets, we can see things are going seriously wrong here. It is not consistently spaced around the outline of what we're adding the stroke to. Even more fundamentally, whilst Panther can in theory load and save PSD files, some PSD files don't load at all. For example, if we try to load the PSD thumbnail file we were working with earlier, we get this message: compressed channel data exceeds declared size. However, I prepared another version of the same Photoshop file with fewer layers in it, a simplified version of the file, and this does load OK. Although, as in GIMP, the text here is no longer editable, and that's a bit strange because if we look here in Preferences, we can see that things are set under PSD to keep editable text, but sadly that hasn't happened, although we have still got our layer effects. If we click over here, we can go back to the layers panel. We can see we've kept our stroke, as we can see, although again it's doing slightly strange things as the thing scales up, slightly strange things at the corners. This all said, Fog Panther is still in alpha, advancing rapidly, and so, in my view, is very much a Linux Photoshop alternative to watch. For those seeking a free alternative, Krita is a very well established open source painting application. The range of different brushes available is very impressive, and if I right click here on the canvas we can bring things up. Let's stay with what we've got at the moment. You can pick all these different brushes and colours like that, and it's a very nice application. The feel of Krita is very good indeed. And Krita also works pretty well with PSD files. And again, not with very complicated ones. If we go do the same test we did in Fog Panther, we'll first try opening up the full Photoshop file, which previews OK, but which doesn't come in. But if we go to the simpler file, which is the one down there, no empty layers and just less data, although it does note that text will have to be converted to vector shapes or pixels, and so sadly the text will not be editable text, but all of our layers have been preserved. Here they are. We can go and look at the layer effects if we wish, the layer style, and here in Krita, if we look down, for example, to stroke, it's been applied correctly. If we scale it, it is scaling correctly around the edges of the drive. Now, due to the growth of cloud computing, Linux users can now also access a wide range of Photoshop alternatives in a browser. I've covered these in depth in a video all about online Photoshop alternatives, with options including Pixlr, which has both free and paid plans, as well as Photoshop for the web, which is the online version of Photoshop itself and requires an Adobe subscription. Also, in a browser in Linux, you can run the ever-popular Canva if you want something template-based rather than a traditional image editing application like Photoshop. Talking of which, our last Linux Photoshop alternative is this, Photopea, which runs in a browser and is truly excellent. And whilst it's browser-based, Photopea does not upload anything to the internet. To really prove this with the application loaded, let's do this, and I'm now going to nip off and do this. There we go, I've removed the Ethernet cable, we're now offline, and so if we go back to Photopea and we'll maximize the window to get maximum working space, we will now bring in the file we were working on earlier, the PSD thumbnail file, which is sitting there. That's the full file, and yes, it comes in perfectly. If we just remind ourselves what it looked like in Photoshop, and if we now come back to Photopea, it's exactly the same, perfect fidelity. The text is editable. As we could see, we could mess around with that, and all the layer effects have been preserved too. We could go across, for example, to the SSD. We could right-click and bring up blending options, just like we can in Photoshop. It's all exactly the same. There's a stroke on that item, and the stroke is working perfectly well. We could scale it up and it works beautifully. What we have here really is an excellent clone of Photoshop. And this includes the interface, which is very, very similar. Tools down the edge, menus across the top, and exactly what we'd expect to be in these menus if we were running Photoshop. It really is most impressive. Photopea can be used for free if you don't mind adverts down the right-hand side of the screen, which looks like this. Or we can come back to what I run, where you have to pay a subscription, which is either $5 a month or $50 a year. And the great thing I think with this model is that if you stop subscribing, you can still use the full version of the software with adverts. And right now, Photopea is my recommended Linux Photoshop alternative. Oh, and just to note, it is pronounced Photopea and not Photopea. Next, we come to Linux alternatives for Adobe Illustrator, which is the leading vector-based drawing application. Or, in other words, Illustrator is used to create artwork based on mathematically defined shapes rather than working with pixels. And here, it's very easy to recommend the best Linux alternative, which is Inkscape. This is a very well established, free and open source application which is able to load and save Adobe Illustrator AI files with excellent fidelity. Here, for example, is a figure I created for a book some years ago. It is an AI file, I've just loaded it in, it's loaded in perfectly, and it remains completely editable. And indeed, if we look back to the figure in Illustrator, we can see that it's exactly the same. Similarly, here is a more recent graphic from my RIS5 2026 update video, and again, if we come back to Inkscape, once more, this is loaded up with no issues and remains an editable file. Some people do initially find the interface here in Inkscape to be a little bit daunting, but if you're used to Adobe Illustrator, the transition learning curve is not that great. Meanwhile, if you want something a bit simpler, other alternatives are available. Not least, most Linux distros include this, which is LibreOffice Draw, part of LibreOffice, which I have to admit to my surprise has also loaded in an Adobe Illustrator AI file with absolutely no issues, and again, everything remains editable. Meanwhile, if you want something browser-based, let's go across to a browser. Here we are. There's a great package currently in development called Graphite. And right now, this is only web-based, but in the future, there are going to be desktop apps for this, so it's a project very much to watch. But for now, we'll launch it in a browser, maybe draw a shape. Let's pick that one. We'll make the weight a little bit thicker because we want to see it on the screen, but there we are. We can draw shapes, draw more shapes. You can see it's a layer-based system. They arrive over here. We've got all the usual tools. We can do node-based editing, pick up a point, move it around like that. Very exciting. And so there we are. This is yet another alternative. However, if you want my current best recommendation for an Adobe Illustrator alternative, there is no question that it's Inkscape. Next, let's turn to an alternative to Premiere Pro, Adobe's video editor. Here, whilst you can mess around with edit list exports, no Linux video editor is able to load Premiere Pro project files. And so, our focus is on functionality alone rather than functionality and file import fidelity. Many different Linux video editors are available, including Lightworks, which we're looking at right now, along with the more basic OpenShot and Shotcut. However, here I'm going to focus on 4 other packages, the first of which is Blender. And this may surprise you, as Blender is fundamentally a 3D modeling and rendering package. But its video editor is now also pretty good, as I've covered in another video. And whilst Blender does not have all the features of Premiere Pro, it does offer a professional level of user control. Next, I want to highlight a new entrant, which is Amber. This is based on the former Olive video editor, which was a great open source application that never got out of alpha. Nevertheless, Olive managed to offer a lot of functionality via a relatively simple interface, and this design approach has continued into the Amber fork, which is nicely uncluttered. And yet, if we add another clip, let's take this deer, drag it down over there, go back so we can see it like that. If we just click on the clip, we bring up comprehensive controls far more easily than we do in some other video editors. And if, for example, we want to make this a picture-in-picture, we could just shrink that down. We could reposition it, for example, up here. And if we want to animate it coming in, we could animate the position like that. Go back maybe over there, push it up off the screen like that. And if we now play things back, there we are. We've got our picture-in-picture effect coming into view. I'm including Amber here as a project with great potential, and it's certainly a video editor to watch. This said, right now, I think that the best Linux Premiere Pro alternatives are Kdenlive or DaVinci Resolve. Here, DaVinci Resolve has a free version as well as a studio version that costs $295 or £225. The program is tricky to install as it only formally supports the Rocky Linux and CentOS Linux distros. And DaVinci Resolve also realistically requires at least 16 GB of RAM and a dedicated graphics card. There's also limited consumer format video support, especially in the free version. In contrast, Kdenlive is free and open source. And it's easy to install and runs on pretty much any computer with 4 GB of RAM or more. And Kdenlive has very wide video format support. With all this noted, DaVinci Resolve is the best Linux video editor. But it's only my recommendation for users with hardware that will run it, and so, on less powerful hardware, for an easy install, or if you're working with consumer video formats, Kdenlive is a better choice. So, let's run them up, and we'll start with Kdenlive. There we go, bit of fast forwarding there in time, and here we have a layout that should be pretty familiar to Premiere Pro users. And indeed, Kdenlive is a very nice piece of software that, as we can see here, I have on occasion used to edit Explaining Computers videos. Moving on, let's open up DaVinci Resolve. Once again, we've arrived in an edit for an Explaining Computers video, but here the interface is a bit different from Premiere Pro and the other editors we've just looked at. Admittedly, we can make it look more similar if we close down the inspector over there. We've now got a double view if we just bring in a clip there as well and go to somewhere more exciting in the clip. Well, should we go, oh, that's more exciting, isn't it? There we go. But regardless, in DaVinci Resolve, we work in 7 different project pages. And here we're in the editor, but we also have a media page, which is where we ingest our footage. And then after that, we have the cut page, which we can use to traverse the whole edit. This is very exciting. We can go back and forth, find wherever we want to in the edit. And then after that, we have got the standard edit page, which is followed by the Fusion page, which is used for complex node-based compositing. After that, we then have a very sophisticated color correction page, followed by the Fairlight audio editor for doing audio work, and then finally, with a little rocket, the deliver page for exporting final output. So, whilst DaVinci Resolve is my recommended Linux video editor if you can run it, it does have a fairly significant learning curve. Finally, let's turn to Linux alternatives for Adobe After Effects, which is a layer-based motion graphics and compositing package. For such work, you could use the node-based compositing available in the DaVinci Resolve Fusion tab, or you could try Blender. But here I'd highlight 2 other applications. The first of these is Friction, for which the 3rd release candidate came out in December 2025. This recent open source contender is focused on 2D graphics and does not offer green screen and other compositing tools. So Friction is not an alternative to all Adobe After Effects functionality. But for the layer-based production of 2D motion graphics, Friction is an excellent application and very much something I'd recommend you check out if you're looking for a Linux Adobe After Effects alternative. Secondly, I'd recommend Pikimove. Inspired by Photopea, this is a free browser-based After Effects alternative which offers both 2D and 3D layer-based motion graphics and compositing. I've covered Pikimove in a dedicated video and it really is very impressive. For example, as we can see here, it can handle the green screen composite and also the motion graphics for the introduction to an Explaining Computers video, although the chroma key tools are not as good as in After Effects. And, like in Friction, we cannot load in After Effects files. Nevertheless, Pikimove does have some very nice features, including the ability to group items, which works very well indeed, and if you want to do compositing and motion graphics in Linux, Pikimove is well worth considering. the lack of a Linux version of the Adobe Creative Cloud Suite certainly remains a barrier to Linux adoption for some users. This said, as we've seen in this video, the range and functionality of Penguin-friendly alternatives does continue to improve. And right now, I'm more positive than I've been for quite a long time about the future of people doing creative work in Linux. But now that's it for another video. If you've enjoyed what you've seen here, please press that like button. If you haven't subscribed, please subscribe. And I hope to talk to you again very soon.